Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. This will be the second episode in the Linux Big Switch, and in this episode, hopefully by now you've already got Linux Mint installed, I'm going to be covering some common use cases. So we're really going to be covering the basics. Things like updates, things like installing our drivers, also installing some applications, or moreover, how to install applications using the native app manager. I'll be discussing ways to install that via the actual repo itself, i.e. the package manager, but also through Flathub and what Flathub is. It's really important and it's good to get to know. After that, I'll be discussing some quality of life things like desktop widgets, for example, and also things like workspaces, basically virtual desktops. This will be a prelude to some more advanced things where we're going to be looking at doing virtualization in Linux Mint, so we can actually put other operating systems inside Linux Mint, which is pretty awesome, as well as some actual benchmarking and performance tests that will be coming up later in the series. Specifically, I'm really interested in learning how gaming actually behaves between Windows 11 and Linux Mint, and because I've got this dual boot setup, hopefully you have too, we've got everything we need in place to do some proper apples to apples comparisons. Anyway, let's hop over now. Let's start talking through Linux Mint. So here I am on the machine that we set up in the last video. I've done nothing else. Everything's just as it is, and it's just been booted up for the first time in a few days. Now, one of the first things I recommend you always do, probably less so if you've actively been using this, but if you followed my last video, you've shut that down and you're now coming back, it's a good idea anyway to check for updates. Now, as you can see down here, because it's the first time, I've got a little yellow dot next to the update manager. So if I click that, it's going to bring it up. And it's going to say welcome to it, and it's going to explain exactly what it does. So it's going to say it wants to set up some security updates, apply software updates, and also talk about doing some system snapshots. Now, security updates, pretty straightforward. Software updates, we're going to come on to software later on in this video. But the system snapshots is probably something you might not have used if you're coming straight over here. It's similar to how Windows does it, in that it takes a snapshot of your system such that if something goes wrong, you can fix it basically. So let's have a quick look in that. We will be coming back to different snapshots with different bootloaders, etc. later on down the series, but let's see what Mint has to offer to begin with. So I'm going to click OK. It should be now going away and having a look at all of the software and the different drivers, etc. for my machine. Now, it's going to ask, do we want to switch to a local mirror? Now, I'm going to say yes, and I recommend you do the same. The reason for that is because the mirror is where it downloads the files from. So a mirror is basically a copy, i.e. a mirror, of the official repo. Now you want to choose one that's close by to you. Now it's going to ask you to authenticate first. And when you do, what it should do is kind of run a ping against lots of different repos that you could choose. So for instance here, I've got my base set as this archive here, and the main for Wilma, which is the version that we're on, we can change that. Now when you click on that, you can obviously see it's going away, it's doing some rudimentary speed tests. I don't think it really matters, just pick the one that's nearer the top or one that's at least in your country. That's probably going to give you the fastest speeds. This says it's only 4 megabytes per second, but hopefully as I demonstrate when I click this, it's actually going to be quicker than that. Now, if you've been watching any of my videos in the past more around the command line interface, you've probably seen it where we add repositories via apt, which is down here, you can see apt, where we add that manually. This is basically just a GUI wrapper for doing that for us. So where we've echoed basically a repository before and then we've reloaded it, that's pretty much what this is going to be doing in the background. You can see there it's updating the cache. So it's probably just running a few commands. Now hopefully what we can do is we can close this down. These will all still be valid. You could obviously refresh if you want to. It shouldn't make a difference. But what will happen now is instead of downloading from, I think the default is the US one, it should hopefully now download from that UK one. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's good to see that there's an AMD 64 microcode firmware for my AMD CPU, and that should hopefully come with security and performance updates for the CPU. So I'm going to install all of these updates, and I'll see you on the other side. When you do click install updates, often what you'll see is you may need some additional dependencies. Ftool is something that's good anyway, and I've used before on my channel. It's an Ethernet tool. It will help you out with doing some network diagnostics, and it's really cool because you can actually blink the LED on the NIC itself, so you know if you've got multiple in your machine, which one is which. Having a look through there's nothing that I don't recognize and looks nasty, so I'm going to click OK. It's going to ask me to authenticate, but once it's done that, it should start pulling down those downloads and begin the update process. We can obviously have a look and see what it's actually pulling down here. And by the looks of it, yeah, I'm getting over 40 megasecond, which is way quicker than that 4 that it estimated. One thing I do recommend is, obviously I'm using this on the MSA1, which has an integrated GPU. If you're using something with a discrete GPU, a bit like on my actual machine when I was testing this out as well, I recommend you go for the NVIDIA drivers, i.e. the ones that are actually by NVIDIA themselves. There are the open source ones that come by default, and if you've got an NVIDIA machine and you've installed Linux Mint, those should be using those. But, and I'll show you in a minute, we can click onto the drivers section and we can actually see the proprietary drivers from NVIDIA. Now it's up to you if you want to install those, but I recommend it because they are more performant. So if you want to max out your performance, probably get rid of some weird nuances, etc., I recommend that you install those. If you wanted to do that, you can just click on the Linux Mint menu down here, and if you put in drivers, it should pick it up through the driver manager. So if you click this, and you've got an NVIDIA card, possibly even an AMD one that you don't have drivers for, you should see a list of all of the options for that NVIDIA card or the AMD card. I think the 550s are the latest drivers as of recording this video. Do note that on Windows it's actually at 562, I believe, so you can see that unfortunately the driver situation for Linux is quite far behind on Linux than Windows. However, I will be getting on to installing some games and doing some benchmarks, and because we've got this dual boot scenario, it's amazing that we can do benchmarks on exactly the same hardware. The only difference is we've got a different OS. So I'm going to let that run and I'll see you on the other side. Because this is downloading firmware and kernel updates, it's probably going to need a reboot, and even if it doesn't ask for one, I would recommend you reboot anyway. So now everything has finished, so I'm going to initiate that reboot. So don't think you can click that, unfortunately. Let's go to the bottom and then let's click shutdown, and we're going to hit the restart. This should now restart my machine, should do any other updates that are required, and fingers crossed we're back up on the boot screen in no time. And so here we are back and we're rebooted, so let's just check that everything is up and running again. Everything looks good. We don't have the notification for the software updates. Let's just click the bell to see what happened. That's just saying that they're network connected, but everything else seems fine. So let's just go to the update manager just in case. And as you can see, there are no updates available. So let's have a look now that we've got our machine up to date. We've pretty much got all of the default things installed. And I did mention about if you need additional drivers, do go and download those from the manufacturer's website. Now let's try and install some common applications. As I said, the whole purpose of this is to move my Windows desktop over into Linux. And there's a number of critical applications I need to be able to do that. Now, before we even start installing applications, what I really want to stress is to make use of the package manager as much as possible. A bit like in Windows, where you'll find all of your applications in the apps and features, that's basically the same process with Linux. If you try and install things outside of the package manager, you're often going to find things haven't installed properly, the operating system doesn't know what's installed, it can make breaking changes, and also when it comes to trying to remove that software, you're really going to struggle. So what I recommend always is to use the package manager. Now you can do that obviously through the command line interface, and we saw an example of that where we were changing it for the updates. It's a little bit like that. There are instances where we will still need to add official repositories through that mechanism, but if we actually stick on the start menu and we go to the software manager, this should pull up a list of all the software, basically a catalog of what's available and what's compatible. Now, not all of the applications you're going to want to install are actually in the software manager, so I'll find an example of that later to install. But just opening this up off the bat, you can see that there's tons of common applications that most of you have probably used. Now, one of those, for example, will be Discord, and if you actually have a look at that, you'll see something interesting called Flathub. For instance, if you see Inkscape and we click on that, that's actually what I use for all my terrible thumbnails. You can see that if we click on this drop down here, we've got two options. But if we go back and we click on Discord, we've only got the one option for Flatpak. What does that mean? Well, after doing a bit of thinking about how I can explain this best, Flathub is a little bit synonymous with Docker in the way that it works. Now, it's not true in terms of a container orchestration engine or anything like that. But what I mean is, when you are deploying something or building an application in Flathub, the idea is to put all of the dependencies and all of the code into that, such that, for instance here, with Discord, they can build one application using Flathub, and hopefully then Flathub across all the various distributions of Linux. They should be able to test and add all of those dependencies, and thus basically build one app for many different Linux distributions. Now, that's a simplified version, but you kind of get the idea for that. Now, you might be wondering, well, why Flathub and why not the package manager? And that's a good question, especially when you go to something like Inkscape and you've got the option of both. Now, let's have a quick look at that. So if we use the system package, that's going to be using the apt repository. And you can see here that that's using version 1.2.2-212 essentially. Now, if we have a look at the Flatpak one, let's have a look. Here we can see that it's actually using version 1.4. And you'll often see that the Flatpak is actually more up to date than the package manager. Now, that's because the package manager is obviously sort of tied back to the version of Mint. And this version of Mint has been out for a while. It's based upon Ubuntu 24, which has been out for a while. So the actual Flathub often gives you the latest version, so version 1.4. Now, there are some differences in how this installs, and often the Flathub version will be larger in size, so 1.2 gigabytes here. And if we have a look at the system package, you can see that it's 31 megs to download and 143 megs of disk space is required in total. So a massive difference in size, but you've got that trade-off of you've got an older version. So with Flathub comes a seamless environment that basically it's going to work hopefully a bit like a container across all different OSs, but you've got the difference of nearly 4 gig versus 140 meg. So if space is an absolute premium, you probably want to go with the package manager, but you're going to have the trade-off of an older version. Now, you do obviously have the option of probably going to their GitHub site, downloading, compiling it and installing it for yourself, but that's not exactly a beginner-friendly way to do it. So I recommend when you're going through this, have a think. If there's a specific version that you actually need, then go and download the one that's for you. But understand obviously now the difference between the two, sort of what's going on in the background and why you might want to use one over the other. So for me, I don't really need the latest version, so I could go for the system package, but I'm going to use this as a good indicator of Flathub. So I'm going to click install on this, and a bit like the other ones we've had before, so different dependencies, Flatpaks also have dependencies. So in order to run this Inkscape, it's going to need to pull down all of this. Now, I suspect it's one of these or many of these that are actually culminating in this huge download size, because it's basically got to have all of those compatibilities to install it across any operating system. It means that Inkscape can basically do one set of deployment and target multiple OSs at once. So now that that's installing, I'm going to skip ahead, and once that's done, we should be able to load this application. I am keen to see what the benchmarking is like between a Flatpak and a native application, so I might get onto that in a future video. But hopefully now if I click launch, it should behave exactly like I expect it to. And yeah, this looks exactly right. So if I do that, I'm going to click thanks, and I'm going to create a new document. Hopefully that loads up, and yeah, we're now into Inkscape. So let's quit that, and I'm going to go back and let's install some common applications. So something most of you are using is something like Discord. So you can go to Discord and you can do exactly the same process as we did before. Again, you'll see that it's quite a beefy install size, again for those exact same reasons. Now that you know how to install applications through the application manager, I wanted to talk about some quality of life things that you could do as well. So you probably remember, was it back on Windows 10 when you could have those sort of funky widgets on your desktop? You can do the same in Linux. And to do that in Linux Mint, they're called Desklets. So you can click on Desklets here, and let's say, I don't know, we want a big fancy clock. We can basically click the clock, click the plus, and there we go, up it is. Again, we could do this for Launcher, that launches a program, and then you can obviously click on this and you can edit which program is going to open. So you can edit the launcher and you can type in the type of application and the program it's going to execute. Now what's cool as well is you can also click on the download, and there's a ton that are already created by the community. So for example, you could have Google Calendar, you could have BBC Weather, Disk Space, all those sorts of things. Let's go with the disk space. Maybe that's a good idea given we were using some Flathubs. So again, I can click on disk space, hit the plus, and then I can move that around. And it's pretty cool to be able to see all of this stuff on your desktop, a bit like building your own sort of homepage that I've covered previously. Obviously, with us being nerds, we always want to know what our CPU load is. So I'm clearly going to be adding that to my desktop, albeit I probably don't need to know every single core. So hopefully we can configure that, and we don't want to show all cores. I want the average of all cores, i.e. the overall CPU usage. So that's now done, and thankfully, yeah, I'm sitting at 1% CPU just idling away on the desktop. That sounds about right. Now, another thing that's great about Linux, and not just Linux Mint, and again with anything Linux, there are multiple ways of doing this. People will have their own favorite. But it's essentially the notion of having tiled applications, tiled desktops, multiple virtual desktops, etc. And in this case, Linux Mint calls them Workspaces. So let's have a look at that. So I've just gone onto the Start menu and started typing in work, and there it is, Workspaces. So if we open this up, what's it saying? It's saying enable the Workspace OSD, allow cycling through Workspaces, only use Workspaces on the primary monitor, and display an expo view as a grid. Those are the default options. So I'm going to leave those as is for the sake of this video and demonstration, but those are the key things we need enabled to get this working. So this might take a little bit of remembering, but essentially we need to do Control, Alt, and up. And as you can see, that's basically popped up the workspaces we have available to us. So at the moment, we've got 4 workspaces set up by default. And as you can see, I've got that Desklet, that application for putting the widgets on my desktop in the first one. So if I click on Workspace 2, we should hop over now to a nice clean workspace. So let's just open up Firefox on this one. And then again, we can do Control Alt Up, and we could shift to, say, Workspace 3. And then, I don't know, what do we want on here? Let's just have the software manager up. And then a Control Alt Up on Workspace 4. Why don't we load up the Inkscape that I installed earlier? So here we've got Inkscape. So now if we do Control Alt Up, you can see that we've got all of these applications open on effectively virtual desktops, i.e. workspaces. And we can go to Workspace 1 like this. And we can actually even move applications from this workspace to another workspace. So for example, if I want to change this one, I can right click on the application that's open, and then I can say move this to another workspace. So let's say I'm doing all of, I don't know, Desklety or configuration on my OS. Maybe I put that on Workspace 4. So hopefully I can click Workspace 4. It's disappeared. Now if I do Control Alt Up, we go down to Workspace 4. And voila, you can see here that we've got it open here. Similarly, if I've got it on this one here for Inkscape, I can just move that basically over to Workspace 1, and then I can switch between Workspace 1, and here we've got it on 1, my default. So that's a really cool way of navigating and having different applications open in separate tabs. It really helps you to sort of preserve the real estate of your screen, especially if you've only got a single monitor and you want to keep things separate, but also sort of consolidated. Now, some other interesting things that you might want to know. If you go into the menu, one of the things we're looking for usually is things like a hardware monitor. So if we scroll down on this list, we've actually got the system monitor here. And what that's going to show is a bit like the Windows Manager, where it's going to show all of the processes that are running and their associated CPU and memory along with the processor ID. And if you wanted to, you can basically click on one and end process. It's exactly the same as sort of running kill in the command line. This is basically giving you that Windows-esque experience. Similarly, we can look at the resources, we can see what the CPU, memory and network is like, and we can also look at the file systems to see which volumes and which drives we've got attached to our machine. So now that I've gone through some of the basics, I'm going to get this set up to replicate my Windows setup. So I'm going to be installing things like, you've already seen, Discord and Inkscape, but other things like DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to be putting on Steam, for example, and I'm also going to be putting on some virtualization. Now, I'm going to be doing that in a separate video, so don't worry about that. The reason for that is slightly convoluted, and I'll get into that why, but it's effectively because I've got some hardware on here that doesn't work. I'm talking about the actual machine that I use day to day, not this MSA one that I'm installing this on at the moment. Anyway, thanks for watching everybody. I'll see you on the next one, and we're going to go through a ton more applications, do some performance benchmarking, and really see sort of how we're getting embedded in with this Linux switch. Please let me know in the comments below how you guys are getting on, any problems you've had, what your experiences are. Really keen to see what people are saying. Obviously hop onto the Discord as well. There's lots of fruitful conversation going over there. Anyway, if you've liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.